Tuesday afternoon, everybody. Welcome back down to my library. And it's December 3rd, and I am finally giving you my Novella November wrap-up. I read 13 books in November, so this was the only other month that I tied the same amount of books that I read. That was back in June. So I will say that this was a very successful month. I read 4, and these were the unread books, so I picked out 4 out of 10 books. But there's other times. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the video. And if you've seen my wrap-ups, I go by the order in which I've read these books. So the first book I completed in one sitting, nonetheless, was This Itty Bitty Boy, The Screaming Tree by Patrick C. Harrison III. And this was a chapbook that only had like 100 copies in the world, and I was number 25. So I was able to snag this at AuthorCon. This was a solid short story. It was about two friends who reminisce on like a horrific memory involving a tree. So this tree manipulated people to do horrific things. It's a very creepy story, and only like 49 pages. So I read this in like a half hour, and this was the book that started off my Novella November vlog. So that's the first book I read. Set that there. The second book I completed was my first audiobook, The Last Final Girl by Stephen Graham Jones. Yes, it took me this long to read another Stephen Graham Jones book. And I really don't know what this author is going to be for me. But this was labeled as a slasher, but it really felt like I was reading a screenplay. And I barely even remember this thing, so I gave this 2 stars. But I mean, I'm willing to try more Stephen Graham Jones. If I just don't like him, then I might unhaul some books from him. But more on that later. Moving on, the first book that I completed on my Kindle last month, and my third book of the month, was a little book called Triggered by Harrison Phillips. And I do apologize for that cover. It's definitely splatterpunk. This one was a lot of fun, but extremely brutal. This was about a man who is a writer, and he's starting to get like bad reviews on books that he has written. So he goes over the edge and he does research to write his next novel. So he goes from like his neighbor's house to like his love interest to his wife and he does horrific things to all of them. This book was messed up, man, but I really enjoyed it. So it almost reminded me a little bit of American Psycho, because you don't know if this dude is really doing all these horrific acts or if he's just imagining it. But this was a very solid book. Pretty messed up, but it was fun. And kind of a parody on splatterpunk. So, moving on. The next book I completed was The Nightmare Collection, Volume 1 by Lee Mountford. This was on Audible, and this was just a collection of short stories. And all these short stories were pretty good, but the one I remember the most, I'm going to have to put it down here because I can't really remember it, but it had something to do with like a sacrifice. I think it was called The Late Shift, but I'll put it down here. Solid collection. So I gave this 4 stars. Moving on from there, my second physical completion, 7 Rabbits by Timothy King. Yes, I finally got around to this. And this released in April of this year. So I decided to check it out. And this was under the slasher prompt as well. But it is so much different from a slasher. So it turns out to be like a home invasion / revenge thriller. So you got a group of football players who go to a cabin for a retreat, but their night is disrupted by 7 rabbits. But you do not side with all these football players because they have done horrific things to girls, and these 7 rabbits are literally trying to get their revenge on what happened to their girls. So I kind of knew the twist about halfway through. I mean, who else could it be? But there were some very gnarly kills in here, and I really enjoyed this one. So I gave this 4 stars. The reason why I gave it 4 stars was that it went from chapter to chapter with like different POVs. But once you got like near the end of the novel, it went into like the central storyline. But there were chapters in here like doing the POVs on like these female victims. And this was kind of a very bleak novel, but very brutal. So look out for essay and rape. So yikes. But very good book. Just a very hard book to read, if that triggers you. But that was 7 Rabbits by Timothy King. Next up was my next Kindle read, Voracious by Wrath James White. And this one was kind of like a zombie-ish novel. And it was about like this clinic who lure people in to have them lose weight, but their metabolism is so fast that they just keep eating and eating until they resort to cannibalism. So, this one was a very, very fun one. I saw this where I forgot how it's said in the review, but it was like COVID with eating disorders or something. But pretty decent book, but very messed up. The ending to it felt kinda okay, where it just ended, but it was a great story. I gave this one 5 stars. So moving on from there, speaking of zombies, I listened to Dawn of the Dead by George A. Romero and Susanna Sparrow. And this is the official novelization of the 1978 classic. So, this is the sequel to Night of the Living Dead, and this is bloodier, bigger, and bolder. So, you gotta know the story to Dawn of the Dead. It's just about like these survivors who get holed up in a mall fighting the zombie apocalypse. Very solid. And I gave this 4 stars. Moving on from there is probably my favorite book that I read in November. Here Comes the Sun by Justin M. Woodward. A splatter western. And this was a book about vampires. So there is a strange creature going around Fort Whipple draining the livestock and draining people. So, very quick read, and I highly enjoyed it. And basically, this dude on the cover is the savior of the town. But very good book, and definitely in contention on being one of my favorites of the year. Here Comes the Sun. Followed by, I took a left turn and I actually listened to Rainbow in the Dark by Ronnie James Dio. So yeah, this is the autobiography of Dio, and it talks about his life, of course, and his stint in Black Sabbath and his solo career. I always really enjoyed Dio, so I've been wanting to read this for a while, and there was a wild card prompt for this, so could have read whatever I wanted. So that was Rainbow in the Dark. And speaking of prompts, I forgot to mention that I actually used Dawn of the Dead as my sci-fi prompt, because I didn't get to my sci-fi book yet again. But anyway, moving on from there, I have A Life of Crime by Aaron Beauregard. 3rd book that I finished by him this year. And this one was very, very weird. So it's literally about this dude that is going through like a life of crime, and he sees a vision of himself in the future, and it gets very, very messed up. So essentially, this dude is kidnapped by this guy, and the guy turns him into like a dog or something. Very weird. And he goes through all sorts of horrific atrocities. And I was like, this thing is very weird. But I gave this 3 stars. It was on Audible. Next one is my last physical book that I completed for November. The first one, You Expect, by Adam Caesar. And I was kind of let down by this one. I mean, it was okay, but it was nothing like what I expected. So essentially, it's about this dude who makes like low budget horror movies in his basement, and this girl comes into his life, and she wants to be the star of one of these films. Turns out she takes it a little bit too far, and she resorts to murder. But then you get to the very end, and they just end up at a convention, and she becomes recognized. Very random, but probably not a new favorite by Adam Caesar, in my opinion. But I really do enjoy his books, and I've read quite a few. I still have a few to get through, but this one was 3 stars. Next, Infested by Carol Gore. And this one was on my Kindle. And it was basically about a campground that gets infested by mutated insects. So, very brutal, but very fun. And I rated this 5 stars. And finally, the last book I completed for November was on the very last day of November. It was a very, very short story called Gobbler by Judith Sonnet. And this was a Thanksgiving horror where this dude has the moniker of the Gobbler, and he just wants everybody to like celebrate Thanksgiving the way it's meant to be. So he targets families, and he does very horrific things to them if they don't celebrate the way they should celebrate Thanksgiving. So this dude goes to like this family's house on Thanksgiving, and he does very messed up things to them. This thing gets very brutal, and only 43 pages, and it was a very tense book. But essentially, when this thing wraps up, you see like a human turducken. I'm like, whoa. But I really did enjoy this book, and according to my notes, I finished 5 books by Judith Sonnet just this year, and I really enjoyed the vast majority of them. So that was the last and final book that I completed for Novella November. So the second annual Novella November is done. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and I'm going to set up to do my December TBR. So I'll see you in a minute for that one. Okay. Adios. Peace.